This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Today on Voices in Validation, we'll hear about the very challenging and rewarding job of compounding pharmacists as they develop specialized medicines for personalized patient care. For many in the compounding industry, there is a satisfaction in working to solve the needs of patients through innovative partnerships with both patient and healthcare providers. But frequently, professionals in this space are hindered by regulatory inconsistencies, special interest groups, lack of transparency, and a tarnished reputation, all of which make this a highly challenging job even more difficult. Our panel of guests today will talk about some of the hurdles and opportunities in compounding. So welcome to our guests, Eric Kastango and Kevin Hansen, both pharmacists in the compounding space. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hey, Stacey.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Of course. It's great to have you here again. Understanding the rules and regulations that govern compounders and compounding facilities can be difficult. Unlike commercially manufactured drugs compliant with FDA, compounded prescriptions must meet different safety, efficacy, and quality standards. Eric, I want to start with you and see if you can begin by describing the unique regulatory guidelines that impact compounding and compounders.
Sure, Stacey. So again, thanks again for having me on. So if we look at the hierarchy of regulations that pharmacists and technicians have to follow, it would be three layers. The first one would be the State Board of Pharmacy. Certainly, they are going to define and regulate the activities that occur that are expected of pharmacists and technicians in that individual state. And prior to 2004, there was no national standard of practice that was universally adopted. Certainly, ASHP, wrote guidelines. They published guidelines in the 1990s and revised that in 2000. And in fact, if you crosswalk the USP Chapter 797, which is pharmaceutical compounding sterile preparations, a lot of what ASHP laid the groundwork in the 90s and early 2000s were incorporated into the first version of USP Chapter 797, which became official in January of 2004. That was the first time that a national standard of practice was described and put out there for everybody to follow. Now, just as a reminder to the listeners, USP has no enforcement authority. So their role is to develop quality standards that are used to define the medicines in the United States, and it defines both the drugs side of it and also the processes that are associated with either preparing the medication or testing the medication or defining the quality of those medications. And so in 2004, USP wrote the standards, and when the chapter came out, it wasn't as well defined as it needed to be, and the guidance that pharmacists needed to follow, right?
Sure.
Pharmacists and technicians are very pedantic. We like checklists. We like recipes. We like flow charts. We like guidance, And the problem or the challenge with the first iteration of the chapter was there was a lot of ambiguity. There was a lot of things that were not fully described or defined, such as all of the facility requirements. So in 2008, a major revision happened to the chapter. I had the privilege of being on that committee during that rewriting phase. And it really addressed a lot of the key areas that are required to maintain a state of control. Facility, personnel, environmental monitoring, cleaning, some quality system stuff. Certainly the focus was on sterility. And I think as we look back on it, the emphasis on quality and accuracy of compounding was not as emphasized as it could be, because it really is like two wings of a plane. You can be sterile, but if you're not accurate, you've missed the point. And if you're accurate but not sterile, you've missed the point.
Right.
So you need both wings for that plane to fly correctly. And I think as we move forward, the 2019 version is out there. Certainly, it's going through, as many of your listeners will know, it's going through a review process, an appeal process. The USP Compounding Expert Committee 2020 to 2025 committee has been formed, and they have started their journey on addressing the issues that were brought up on appeal last year. So with all of that in mind, the guiding light will be the state boards of pharmacy. They look to the USP chapters, and certainly NABP, the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, have embraced the USP standards on compounding, both sterile and non-sterile. And there's a corresponding chapter, USP 795, that defines the key practice guidance for pharmacists and technicians to follow when they do non-sterile compounding. And then it's up to the states to either embrace it by reference, embrace it by codifying it, which means they basically either cut and paste or rewrite their own, or they have their own strategy in doing that. But pharmacy, in the world of regulations as it relates to 503, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, is directed by the guidance for 503A pharmacies. They're in their compounding pharmacies.
Right.
So we know in 1998, the FDA Modernization Act introduced the concept of 503A, and that was the FDA's attempt in the late 90s of creating a bright line between manufacturing and compounding, because there were a lot of large-scale compounding operations that were really crossing the line and acting more as a manufacturer than a pharmacy, which again is defined by pharmacist-physician patient relationship, the presence of a patient-specific prescription, and that became important. And then, post the New England compounding debacle in 2012, Congress passed the Drug Quality Security Act, known as the DQSA, Title I Compounding Quality Act, and that's where they added this new category, a new section to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, 503B, and that created the bright line between what was within the purview of pharmacy and what was in the purview of the FDA. And it really, I believe, created a nice bright line that we have to follow. And now we just need to have the rest of the USP chapters kind of get finalized, let day-to-day practitioners like Kevin and others, be able to follow, know what they need to comply with.
Right.
And I'm sure Kevin will weigh in and, are you following the 2008 version? Are you following the 2019 version? I think the industry is in somewhat of a flux on knowing what the rules of engagement are. But, everything resides with the State Board of Pharmacy being a compounding pharmacy's source of truth, and then using the USP chapters 795, non-sterile, 797, sterile, and then related corresponding chapters on sterility and endotoxin and the like to really define how we act as compounders within the practice of pharmacy.
Yes. And so it sounds like the different USP state boards need to come to some consensus on some of these guidances so that there can be standardization, across the U.S. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So the USP has to finalize what the chapter will look like, Stacey.
Yeah.
And then the state boards of pharmacy can decide what they want to do, and many of them will just, when the USP finalizes the chapter and makes it official, many states will accept it by reference. So whatever the current USP chapters are on compounding, whether it's the non-sterile or sterile, that will be their guiding light. So the state boards of pharmacy don't directly influence the standard setting process, but like everybody, during the public comment period, people can weigh in, and
Sure.
we know that the state boards of pharmacy have weighed in, FDA, and several other groups. So it really is a collaboration, but the responsibility of USP is to write those quality standards that dictate the practice of sterile compounding.
Excellent. Thank you. So, looking at the hospital setting, Kevin, and even broader to healthcare system, which may mean a variety of regulations and guidelines are constantly at play. Can you describe how the current regulatory framework drives the decisions and best practices throughout your healthcare system? And I have a couple follow-ups for you on that, but I'll let you start there.
Absolutely. I'm very proud and enjoy working in the healthcare setting. We're very focused on taking care of our patients, the patients that are here, and best optimal outcomes. And I think it's, without saying a compounding topic, and we start talking about regulations as our first topic, and some would say that compounding within pharmacy is the most heavily regulated and overseen area. And I would agree to that. However, as we've seen over the past few decades here, that we continue to have compounding related tragedies across the nation. And this was even after some of these great quality and standards that Eric mentioned have been put into place.
Right.
So we have disparate practices between the states. Some states have just recently started saying, we are going to adopt, what USP has into our laws, into our regulations. And so we're seeing some positive trends into the right direction for sure. And the other thing to note is a lot of these standards are minimum standards. And so for a lot of our practices is are we okay with just meeting the minimum? And we try to focus on, well, how can we expand out of that and focus on best practices? Because, in some of these tragedies, when you go back and look at the practice settings, well, they had clean rooms, they had hoods, they had people that have been garbed, right? So it's not enough of just having the infrastructure. It's how you work in them. And so we do a lot of focus on the operations of the compounding process. The environment is definitely important, but we have to think about both the flow of product and the flow of people in our compounding spaces, especially within our sterile compounding spaces. When it comes specifically, I know you mentioned in hospitals and how that kind of differentiates, is we have, everyone thinks their practice setting is probably unique, but I think our practice setting is very unique in the fact of we have a criticality with getting these compounded products to patients in an urgent manner. And it puts us into a position where the whole discussion around anticipatory compounding, why do compounders anticipatory compound? And when a hospital setting, we have the sickest acute critical patients coming through our emergency department or in our ICUs that demand drugs, of which a lot of them are compounded in a timely manner to promote best patient outcomes. So the best example is compounded antibiotics for patients that are presenting in septic conditions. There's excellent outcome in clinical literature saying that minutes that go by increase the chance of mortality. They increase the risk of mortality.
Sure.
So in many of these compounded antibiotics, we're compounding them in anticipatory quantities and putting them in areas where as soon as that condition is identified in the emergency room or in these areas, they can be quickly administered to those patients. And is it efficient or effective to do that? No, we have drug waste to do that. But again, it's all focused on the patient and how can we ensure that when that scenario arises, they have a drug where they can treat that condition. So a lot of our efforts go into the clinical use of the drug and how compounding can support those clinical outcomes.
Sure. And so compounding, I guess traditionally is very personalized treatments for patients, by a prescription. So if there's a particular drug, I guess that's not readily available, or that needs to be created in a special dosage because of someone's age or weight or whatever reason, that's where compounders have really, come in and filled the gap. However, based on what you're saying and just what I know, more and more often you're able to create compounds buy multiple units that you know you're going to use because it's pretty much a standard drug that you're going to use, say, in your OR or your ER or somewhere like that. Is that correct?
Yep. So I want to mention one word you said. You said fill the gap. And I want to bring attention to that because the only reason we're in the business of compounding is because there's a gap.
Right.
There is not a conventionally manufactured FDA approved product that's on the market, right? So FDA views as what we do as compounders as a non-approved drug product. And the reason we can do that within the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is because we have exemptions saying, hey, there's a need for this because no product exists that we need to compound it, right? And again, if we focus on best practices, ISMP aligns and says, if there is a conventionally manufactured product on the market, which is a pre-mixed, ready-to-administer product, we need to purchase it and we need to use it.
Right.
Because the FDA would say us compounding that, we're really creating a inferior product from the sense of we are not compounding in current good manufacturing practices, but your FDA is. And so they view that as actually a public health risk of
Correct.
compounding products that are conventionally manufactured. So with my team, we really focus on, let's get those premixes, let's get them into place, and let's focus on truly where our compounding services are truly needed, right?
Right.
Well, that gap
also,
is huge.
Kevin, oh, yes.
I was just going to say the gap is still large. We
Yes.
have that gap between there and manufacturing. And so Eric previously mentioned after this NECC event is the creation of this intermediary between what we're doing on the front lines on these 503A pharmacies and what our manufacturers are doing, right? And they created this 503B, which is what you were mentioning of creating things maybe in a higher amount of units or things that are maybe more complex.
Right.
But in the current setting, we're still seeing gaps. We're still seeing gaps between a 503A and a 503B, and even 503Bs within our manufacturing. And so the current state is we're getting a lot of guidances, both from the FDA of trying to provide how do we address those gaps and how do we define those boundary lines between what is truly manufacturing, what is outsourced compounding under the FDA, and what is state-guided 503A compounding. And so that's kind of the everyday world that Eric and I, kind of navigate through and try to figure out how we can best take care of our patients.
Sure. No, and that makes perfect sense. And Kevin, because you are not just responsible for compounding there at the hospital, but really for the entire healthcare system, I wondered if you could just talk for a minute about how these guidances impact your physician care service and what ways you can support the compounding needs of doctors' offices, or can you?
Yeah, great question. So one of the things that we're seeing, nowadays with hospitals is that many hospitals cannot survive on their own financially.
Right.
And so many hospitals are forming larger health systems. And we're seeing patient benefits of that, of having, accountable care organizations, of having all of the different care under a single organizational umbrella. But what that does is now you have several facilities or several different hospitals, clinic, outpatient pharmacies, surgical centers. You have everything now where compounded products are needed. And so it's an operational challenge to determine how can we meet all the standards outlined by USP, FDA, all of the things that Eric talked about, and still meet our patients' demands. Because, of course, we do not have a full clean room suite in every physician's office, right? We have this. So how do we continue to do that? And so that's where creative strategies certainly come into play. So, for example, we're investing into building infusion services within our existing clinic infrastructure. And those are compounded sterile preparations. And so we actually have it set up where we compound those at the main hospital and have couriers that get those to the clinics when they're needed. So again, from a best practice, we're not having those compounded at the bedside or maybe in a med room or on the top of a counter somewhere, which is not ideal, where we can't certainly maintain the sterility of that product and the quality. We want to do that where we have the technology, right? When Eric talked about the safety and accuracy of these compounds, and also preserve the sterility and the quality of that final preparation. So then the operational challenge is, how do I get it to that clinic or to that surgery center in a timely manner? And so we do have dedicated couriers. And so there's a lot of moving parts, but we're even talking about drones. There are some health systems in the nation that are currently droning their compounded preparations to these different areas throughout their health system. And so I think there's some interesting kind of technologies on the horizon that are going to assist with this. But it's certainly a real challenge to ensure that we have the appropriate access to compounded preparations, where the standards and the regulations aren't getting in the way to preventing patients in need from getting these types of preparations.
Sure. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about tribal knowledge versus best practice, because obviously, USP, they outline the guidelines, and in theory, those should be the best practices. But I know pharmacists, compounding pharmacists like the two of you have worked in the industry for long enough to know what works and what doesn't work. And like you just mentioned, Kevin, sometimes you have to get a little creative inside the guidelines there. So, Eric, I'm gonna start with you, but Eric and Kevin, I want you both to talk a little bit about the disconnect that seems to be between these two concepts of tribal knowledge versus best practices. Eric, can you kick us off there?
Yeah. So, a couple little points of clarification, Stacey. So USP are not guidelines, they're standards. And, that's just one of my personal pet peeves, because guidelines mean you have the option to not comply. And,
sure.
Part of the response, it was funny. I just read the Pharmacist oath again. I haven't read that in 38 years since I graduated when I recited it. And, yes, Kevin, it's been that long, and you're probably not even 38 years old. So that's even more depressing, but we'll roll with it for a moment. But, one of the things that struck me in reading the Pharmacist oath is that we will comply with applicable regulations and standards and best practices. And, I think the challenge is that, people respect what other people inspect. And I can tell you, when I started in this industry in 1980, it was see one, do one, teach one, the practice of medicine, right? We eschew the checklists and you think about all of the pushback on the Tol Gawande on the checklist, but we know the value of checklists. We look at aviation and how checklists, when pilots use them, have saved lives and improved the safety of aviation and, air travel. And when we look at tribal knowledge, is that when, it's kind of like that campfire game where you go out, you're camping and you say a phrase and it goes around the campfire. And by the time it gets back to the beginning, it's not even close to what you started. And what ends up happening is when we do tribal knowledge, which is verbal tradition, is storytelling, right? Like, to me, I'm a better storyteller than a reporter, right? I get the general concepts, but there are there are a lot of people who are very good reporters. They can remember the details, the specifics. And so depending on the type of people you have, you're taught on how to practice, right? And the problem is that pharmacy, because ASHP had guidelines, right? Now, guidelines in that manner meant that, well, they were there, but they were too expensive. They were too hard. Some people didn't even know about them. And so they, you just say, well, how hard could sterile compounding be? Because we've always assumed that everything we made was sterile. We just had to worry about chemical stability. So it's how we behave in the hood. And, I think my biggest, statement, I would say, having been in hundreds of hospitals over the last 15 years, and I would say thousands, is nobody knows what right looks like, right? Everybody has their own version of the way we do things. And that comes from tribal knowledge versus best practices that have been defined through SOP, first of all, through standards, right? So as Kevin talked about, 797 or 795 are the minimum standards. This is the basement or the foundation, not the ceiling. So there is a lot of room that we have in doing better. And I think that we could do better, and we should do better, and we could do more, and we should do more in terms of making sure that our people are properly trained. You think about training people. that instead of storytelling, do they have the standards? Have they read the standards? Have they used guidance documents? Have they used training materials that have been vetted in the industry? Have they used other things that people have published? And I think the work that Kevin's doing out of Cone is important, because his peers need to see success, right? They need to see it's possible and what can be done and how to view compounding processes with, from leaders like Kevin, because that is the only way that we're going to advance the ball. But we have to use standard operating procedures based on the standards that have been published in USP to define how we behave. And then when we train people, we use the SOPs, not what Kevin says or Eric says or Stacey says, because people don't understand the why behind the what. And that's what happens over time, is that, and we see this now. I call, where we are with 797, having been there since the beginning and then some, it is this Groundhog Day, right? So all of the people that we trained 5-10 years ago, they have either gone on, moved up, moved out of the organization, and now Kevin has to hit the restart button and start from the beginning again to bring everybody forward. And we need to figure out a better way to ingrain these practices into pharmacy operations, so it is this standard operating procedures that are always followed. But we have to do a better job in pharmacy schools. We have to do a better job in tech training. And we have to use a standard set of principles so everybody's being taught the same way. So compounding is not going to be done differently in North Carolina than it would be in New Jersey or Massachusetts or Arkansas or Colorado. And that's the problem, is you have these takes on what's right and wrong, and what's permitted and what's not permitted. And then you just have the normal, people will only retain 75% of what you say. And then over time it changes and mutates. And then by the time you come into an organization, what do you hear a lot of times? Well, we've always done it this way, right? Yeah. And it's like, why do you do it this way? Well, I don't know. Nobody knows about the SOPs. Nobody knows about the standards. Nobody knows about the history. And that's my greatest fear, is that even though we're like 10 years out from New England compounding, not quite, there's a lot of people who don't even know why we are where we are today with all of the pharmacy standards and all of the regulations and all of this onerous hardship that is being heaped on pharmacy. There's a reason that we're here, but the problem is that there's no memory. There's no institutional knowledge of that. And that is one of the things that I think we got to figure out as a profession, is to keep, not lose ground as through attrition and as people come and go in the organization and in the profession. So I don't know how you feel about that, Kevin, if I'm off or close or.
Yeah, Kevin, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, you're spot on. I was shaking my head, absolutely, just reminiscing on a lot of those items. And I think, I'll add to that in, pharmacist or pharmacy involved in compounding is a pseudo relatively new thing. It always didn't be that. It always hasn't been that way. And if we look at, some of the things we're seeing, is that there's a lot of sterile compounding, at least in hospital settings, used to be done by nurses at the bedside, right? And so we look at some of those anecdotal practices, and they're like, oh, well, Kevin, back in the day, we used to add concentrated potassium chloride to our large IV fluids. Why all of a sudden do I have to do it in this big old clean room with all this technology and things? And so we're kind of stuck, when you're talking about this tribal knowledge, with some of these anecdotal stories of, well, we used to do it that way. Now, why is it not a problem? Because we've never harmed anybody. And, again, Eric is right, is we need to focus on the why. We certainly don't have a lack of standards. We don't have a lack of guidance. We don't have a lack of education that's out there. It's really an understanding. And in pharmacy, Eric mentioned we are very type A. We like our checklists. We like all of these things. But these concepts in compounding from a sterile perspective is all risk-based. So when you have somebody who's so type A, how do you describe risk to somebody and the different practices and get them to think more in like an FMEA, a failure mode and effect analysis process, to say, hey, if this was a nuclear industry, right? We wouldn't, talk about this and say, well, we haven't had any explosions, so, I guess this is okay, right? We look at how do we reduce that risk. And so it's a mentality change that we need to focus on with these folks. And that's why I'm happy to be involved in talks like this and educating and explaining the why behind a lot of these practice changes and provide leadership on these topics, because I think that's truly where the gaps are. So spot on.
One other thing, Stacey, if I can just tag on to what Kevin talked about. I'm a bachelor's educated. I have a bachelor's of science in pharmacy, and as I was in pharmacy school, graduated in 1983, the PharmD program was really coming into its own. Certainly, California was the cutting edge. Late 60s, they had already defined it. It was slowly moving east. Now you can't get a BS in pharmacy.
Right.
And I think the role, as I've said in other programs, compounding is not sexy to pharmacy. Right? It's the necessary evil that is been tagged to our profession. But, one of the things that I'm gravely concerned about is that if we surrender that privilege of compounding and dispensing and distribution, which in my mind is quite sexy. And if you think about all of the cool stuff Kevin is doing at Coram, it's cutting edge. And this is, people should be excited about this because it's technology, it's automation, it's IT, it's so many facets other than a needle and a syringe and the drone of compounding. But my concern is that because compounding is not sexy driven by pharmacy curriculum, and the technicians are stepping up. We have to elevate the role of the technicians, pharmacy, you can call them pharmaceutical technologists, call them whatever you want. But even there, you have some states that only require a high school diploma. Some states require a 2-year community. Some states require a 4-year undergrad. I mean, the unevenness in the qualifications of the individuals, while, pharmacy is getting, it's 6 years for a PharmD and then 1 or 2 years postgraduate with residencies. I mean, it's almost parallel to medicine. And, a lot of PharmDs are coming out and they're like, well, my whole curriculum was geared to clinical. And now I got to go staff an IV room. And that's below me. That's not my job. And we have to make sure that as we're trying to advance pharmacy and practice at the highest level of our degree and our license, that we got to fill in the gaps and create this robust sexiness associated with compounding and making sure that whoever does it correctly, does it consistently, uses a well-defined set of SOPs based on the current standard best practices and what we know to be the best way to deliver safe and effective care to patients.
Thank you, Eric. And just to follow up or to kind of round this out a little bit, because we're talking about obviously standards and best practices in compounding. And I think a lot of what we have discussed so far is relates to 503As, but there is another subsection in compounding, which is 503B. And I'm hoping that one of you can help our listeners really understand by maybe a scenario or just how do you differentiate between what falls under 503A and 503B and tie that back to the standards and best practices that exist currently.
Yeah. So, if you're good, Kevin, I'll take the first crack at that.
Sure.
So 503B, Stacey, according to the DQSA, has to comply with current good manufacturing. So that's 21 Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, Part 210 and 211.
Right.
So those are the human drug GMPs. In addition to that underlying quality system, because if you look at 21 CFR 211, the drug GMPs, they're very, very nondescript. They're just say you shall have a quality system.
Right.
And then when you get inspected, the FDA is going to inspect, right? So they approve drugs and they inspect facilities that manufacture approved drugs. So they're going to inspect to make sure that your quality system, and they're expecting you to be the expert, that you know that your processes and your people and your facility and everything about your operation is going to yield a safe and effective product, right?
Sure.
And the major difference is night and day. It's little league. It's little league baseball to major leagues. Because as a pharmacist who has run a GMP operation, the knowledge, and I thought before I went and worked for Baxter, I thought I was a really good compounder until I got trained on GMP, and then I realized how much I didn't know and how much. And this is where we have the struggle with 797, because the big pharma and the FDA looks at that and says, you're doing on a small scale what we require the big manufacturers to do on a large scale, and your quality system, in our opinion, is totally inadequate. And there is this huge tug of war and having been on the committee, is how much is enough from a standard perspective and how much is too much. And it's this fine line. But, as Kevin mentioned, when we cross that chasm and we go to 503B, now we can do non-patient specific. Now we can do compounding for office use. Now we can do these, large scale batches. But there is an existing infrastructure there. And I would far say it is, there is a fair amount of dynamic tension between the agency, the FDA, and the manufacturers. And they're always back and forth. It exists at the state level and at the practitioner level, at the hospital level, but not quite as much. And I would say North Carolina Board of Pharmacy, certainly the leadership of Jay Campbell and Crystal and everybody who's out there trying to make sure that all of the practitioners in North Carolina are practicing, as well as they can. North Carolina, I would hold as one of those paragon states that get it. They understand the importance. They support pharmacy, but they hold them accountable. And that, it's kind of like traveling on the highway. If the cop is always there, then you're always going to go the speed limit. And we need to have more of this, we need this more accountability to be there. But the major difference is something that why a lot of the initial 503Bs failed, which is you can't take a 797 operation and scale it up. You got to bring in the mindset of GMP, validations, and the difference would be, doing a math problem and just writing the answer. So that's pharmacy. But in GMP, you have to show how you got the answer, show all your work, and prove to me that you use the right theories and you use the right numbers in the right place at the right time every time. And it's a matter of discipline. It's a matter of intensity. It's a matter of accountability. It's a matter of documentation. So it really is trying to shore a gap up. But again, absolute role for pharmacy, immediate use, patient specific, got to deliver that medication when the nurse needs it for that patient under that clinical need. And this is where, having this new category is supposed to smooth out that continuum that we're continue to struggle with. And I think forever and a day, pharmacy will continue to compound because our drug shortage problem is not going to go away. Right. Automation, I think, is going to be the key. We have to figure out a way to scale it up, make it fast, make it accurate, and make it cost effective so everybody can embrace it and not just those few hospitals that have that critical mass and make it standard of practice.
And I think in theory, because I've spoken with you about this before, Eric, the difference between 503As and 503Bs in theory is pretty clear because of the GMP standards. Right. I think my line of questioning or where my thought goes is more in terms of the anticipatory compounding that a lot of hospitals and healthcare communities are using. So when does that cross the line into really needing to be in a 503B space, or does it ever? Is it just strictly the GMP standards and practices that qualify you as a 503A versus or a 503B versus a 503A. Kevin, maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. And I know specifically for sterile compounds, where the FDA is concerned is for these products that are held for extended periods of time, right? Okay. So usually those are the anticipatory compounds, not all the time, but it's the things that have longer beyond use states than some of the default beyond use states that we see in the absence of sterility testing that's allowed under USP 797. Even with NECC, when we looked at the patients that were harmed the most, it was with the products that had sat for the longest period of time or towards the end of the shelf life of that product that was there. And so when we talk about the influences on our sterile preparations, you look into the chapters of USP 1211 on sterility assurance, and we see an abundance of all of these different systems that always have to be running to a T to ensure that we do not have a sterility failure or contamination of that product. And really, in the absence of a CGMP practice, it's how can you ensure that those systems are always running? And we even know that even with sterility testing, that's not enough. So it's really then gets to focus on the actual practices of when those critical transfers or the sterilization occurs, right? So one observation that I made, for example, in my position is that we actually partner a lot with 503Bs to fill in some of the gaps that we have for highly complex or for things that are in high volume, and we inspect their compounding pharmacies. One observation that I made is that they're using the exact same type of hoods that I have in my clean rooms, right? They have just as much manual processes, if not more, right? In some instances, not true of all. And so it's how do we focus on how that compound is prepared? And that is where I think there's a large opportunity for automation, right? And specifically with IV robotics, which we've invested a lot of time and money here in that cone, because it is compounded automation using something called a restricted access barrier system, where you're taking the number one source of contamination for our sterile preparations, which is human contamination, usually done in a touch form, touching a critical site or blocking an airflow in some way, and you're removing or minimizing those aspects by having the critical transfers completely done inside of that restricted access system, which is ISO 5 laminar airflow. So really from that concept, even though we're not running CGMP here at the hospital, we're performing best practices by eliminating those or minimizing those contamination risk points. And I think there are several 503Bs that are starting to pick up on this as well and starting to automate some of their lines and get more robotics, because that's really what we're seeing in manufacturing, right? If we go over to the Pfizers and the big pharma, they are all done in restricted access barrier systems using highly autonomous lines. And so, how can we do that at every level, at the small scale in the 503A, at the medium large scale, the 503B, and then the massive scale with the manufacturing. So I think we have a lot of opportunities to learn from these practices of these FDA manufactured, and how do we trickle some of those practices down into the 503As and 503Bs.
Thank you. Yeah, and so and thank you for the clarification, both of you. And you started to talk about the technologies and innovations really at Cone Memorial. And for some of our listeners who have previously heard you speak with me, they will know that you have IV robotics going to create your ready to administer syringes. Yep. Which you just mentioned again. And so I want to, because you've had a chance to already kind of talk about that in the past with us, I want you to expand on that a little bit more, Kevin, sure. In terms of the technologies, the industry embracing technologies and innovations, and being that you are a leader in that space, where do you see Cone Memorial going next? Sure.
So we look at across our entire spectrum to say, where can we expand automation? Where can we expand robotics? So we certainly use it at our main hospital for those batch prepared, ready to administer syringes and bags that we had discussed previously. But also there's other things with robots where there's benefits. So we actually have specific robots within our oncology sector to create patient-specific chemotherapy doses. And the benefit there is not only we're getting highly accurate doses through gravimetric weighing of each of the products, but we're also minimizing exposure to hazardous medications for the preparer. And so by using robots and those restricted access barrier systems, we really are seeing benefits in multiple different areas of where we can provide products to our patients. And so we're seeing how can we get more products through fully autonomous IV compounding, right? We still have some processes that are very manual. We have some practices that are semi-automated, where we're using barcode scanning and maybe some pictures of the compounds in the process, all the way up to our fully automated compounding practices. So how do we look at that entire spectrum and say, how can we get more products through this safer, fully autonomous IV workflow?
Excellent. And Eric, staying with the idea of technologies and innovations in the space, because I know you work, as a consultant with many different groups. I'm hoping that you can obviously share any information about technologies and automation that you'd like to, but also how will these new technologies be treated under current regulatory guidance or standards?
Good questions. So if I could go back and just clarify one thing that you had asked that I'm not sure that either Kevin and I answered, is about anticipatory compounding.
Yes.
The FDA has published a number of 503A related guidance documents. And the cap for pharmacies is 30-day supply.
Okay.
To Kevin's point is that the FDA says that Kevin can have up to a 30-day supply based on historical trends of product usage to have on his shelf. And their concern is twofold. One is mass casualties, that if you make hundreds of doses incorrectly, you're not going to harm one patient, you're going to harm dozens of patients. But for Kevin's purposes, why would he need more than 30-day supply for an acute care setting? So even though these are artificial lines, it again, the way I look at all of this stuff is that 797 is a safe harbor for pharmacy to compound and do what they need to do to take care of patients. And the FDA has tried to put these bright lines around the corners that give us clarity on when we cross the line. And I think that's the challenge, is that we would look at that either in the Board of Pharmacy Regulations or USP, but as practitioners, we need to look at the FDA guidance that they publish for 503As, certainly the USP standards and what they say, but they're not going to be specific on the regulatory aspect of it. They're going to be specific on the quality aspect of it. And then the states will tie both the standard and the safety factor and the regulations all together. And the state boards of pharmacy really are incentivized to work hand in hand with the FDA. So it is a collaborative effort, which is one of the shortcomings that were identified out of the New England compounding.
Right.
So sorry for that.
No. Thank you for the clarification.
So about automation, I think the regulations, there is a move afoot by a coalition of practitioners and organizations called Thrive. And that's being led by Mark Neuenschwanzer. And I think, Stacey, he would be a wonderful guest to interview because Mark has been like I've heard him referred to as the father of barcoding in pharmacy. And as I mentioned earlier, the focus of 797 has been really on sterility and not a lot of explicit guidance on accuracy. I mean, we would always assume that we're picking the right product, but a lot of these IV workflow systems that are now being developed and implemented in hospitals, I look at them as the first important step as you move to automation. And if you can integrate automation as part of using an IV workflow system, which will give you traceability, recallability, because what some of the statistics from these softwares have shown is that pharmacists and technicians 10% of the time choose the wrong drug from the get-go. And I don't know, Kevin, if you've heard the number higher or lower, it's around that 10%. 1 out of 10 medications we pick to choose are wrong, Stacey. So you pick the wrong drug from the beginning. That is a recipe for disaster that, as Kevin mentioned before, has happened despite all of the things with the guidance, is that we have to, because of the number of activities and the data elements that are coming across our eyes every day, we have to use machines and technology to help us make sure that we don't miss these critical steps, because garbage in, garbage out. And that's why it's so important. So the standard right now is in the process of either explicitly adding information about IV workflow systems in the chapter, or creating a separate chapter on the use of these technologies. But, a lot of it would be economics, right? Not everybody can afford it. And so I had an old mentor who said, if money was not an issue, is what we're talking about the right decision? And if the answer is yes, then we got to figure out how to pay for it.
Sure. Yeah, and that makes sense. It seems like there is a considerable amount of risk reduction and a boost in accuracy and cost savings once you have the automation systems, right? Because I would think there's less waste and less human contamination, which ultimately is where most of the non-sterility issues come from.
Right. And I think one thing I'll add is, as a myth, whenever anyone hears the word robots and automation and technology, they see it as almost a threat to the profession. And I can say, for somebody who has implemented IV robots and are expanding and growing these programs, they usually require more people. So we've actually hired, quality assurance managers and additional technicians and engineers, because somebody has to run it, somebody has to maintain it, somebody has to clean it, somebody has to fix it, right? Somebody has to build the protocols and do the programming. And so it's really an assisted piece to the workflows to have them safer. It's not a replacement. So I always hear that as kind of like a threat to our profession, that the robots are taking over, but I really see them as our allies.
Sure. I appreciate that. I have a question for, I'm going to throw it to you first, Kevin, but Eric, you might have some insight on this too. The FDA is currently working on a list of essential medicines as part of a recent White House initiative, based on the supply chain issues that we've had during this pandemic. And that list of essential medicines will, from what I hear, include a bulks list. And I'm just wondering if this is going to have any impact on the compounding space at all, maybe even offer compounders an opportunity to better serve the market as shortages occur for some of these drugs that are on these lists. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll just say a quick comment and let Eric chime in on this as well. But I think there's certainly, pros and cons to FDA's approach in this. And from my perspective, I see it as a pro. And the reason is when I go out and let's say I have a need for a certain drug in a syringe, I look at my 503Bs, I'll see that same product listed twice. One of them may be $12, the other one is $25. And what am I going to purchase? I'm going to purchase the cheaper one because it's the same product, same drug, same concentration, same everything. But what you don't know on the back end is one was made only using sterile to sterile, FDA conventionally manufactured ingredient, and the other was using API ingredient where we don't know where it's came from and may not have been under the same standards and things. And so there's some confusion there. And so having the FDA involved to say, well, there's not a clinical need to compound this from a bulk powder, because we know from get-go these APIs have quality issues. Not all of them, but we don't know where the source is, because unfortunately that's proprietary information, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it is what it is. Further, they're non-sterile. So there has to undergo a sterilization step, whether that's aseptic filtration, whether that's terminal sterilization. And again, when we're trying to reduce contamination, we're starting with something we know is contaminated. Well, that can increase the risk of the final product not being contaminated. So again, from my practice setting, do I see it as a benefit? I do, because I want to ensure that when I am getting these bulks products that are compounded from folks, it's one that truly need to be done using that, and not just because it's a cheaper ingredient or a different process. And I don't want to comment too much more on it. We don't do a lot of bulk compounding within our institution, so that's why I comment from a 503B perspective, because we really do rely on them to make the correct choices and the safe choices to compound from these substances.
And that's an important distinction for folks, because I for one didn't realize the difference between the two drugs as you just described. Eric, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. So if you think about it, there's two types of compounding that can be done either by 503As, compounding pharmacies, or 503Bs, outsourcing facilities. So the first choice for 503As is, as Kevin mentioned, if it's commercially available, ready to use, you buy it. If not, you're allowed, according to the Pharmacy Practice Act and the FDA and USP standards, to compound for your patient, patient-specific prescriptions. Certainly, if you need to use bulk API, the difference between sterile to sterile compounding, which means taking approved drugs and diluting it or putting it in a different dosage form or a different administration container, is maintaining sterility, because that approved drug has already been proven to be sterile, safe, and effective. When you start with a nondescript white powder, you have to achieve sterility. And the amount of expertise and the sophistication of sterilization practices is significantly more difficult. Not you can do it, but you have to know what you're doing, because you have to take something that's not sterile and make it sterile and make sure that nothing changes to that drug during that entire process. And this is where we see the essential copies actually getting played out more in the 503B, because the default position, because I'm working on several 503Bs now, the distinct difference is that the DQSA 503B, Section 503B, says that a outsourcer has to use an approved product unless it's on drug shortage, and only then can you use a bulk powder to compound. Now, this positive list or this bulks list is there a clinical need that can't be met by the commercially available product? And that and there is, the FDA issued their final guidance supposedly January of 2018 on the essential copies, but because of the question is, when a 503B takes something that's an approved product and dilutes it and takes it from a vial to a syringe, is that an essential copy? And there's no, according to the guidance, it is, because just diluting it or putting it in a syringe is not the clinical difference that Kevin mentioned, because it's not meeting, and putting it in a dosage form is a convenience factor, not a clinical need. And so everybody is hoping, and based on the way that the FDA issues these guidance documents, the FDA published a update in September, and I just posted it on LinkedIn this morning, that in the next several months, and the anticipated time is probably January, February, that the FDA is going to clarify this point, whether when a 503B starts with an approved product and dilutes it and takes it from a vial to a syringe or a vial to a bag, is that a violation of the essential copies rule? And that's what everybody is hoping for. And I think once we have clarity, but certainly the next thing is that if a lot of 503Bs are just using bulk API, that is in direct conflict with the DQSA and the guidance that has been published by the agency on the starting material.
So it will impact in some ways, potentially.
Cost of goods.
Yeah, maybe not to the extent.
We'll have to wait. Pricing and then it comes down to economics again, right? Because Kevin has to report, right? His organization, his pharmacy department has to report cost of goods, and you think about, I don't know what your drug budget is down at Cone, but hospitals have 10 million, 100 million. 200, what's Cleveland Clinic? What did Scott say? $1 billion cost of goods on drugs, Stacey. So when you deal with a bulk powder that is pennies on the dollar versus vials like, what is it, ephedrine, that's $2,000 for a 10 ml vial, a 50 milligram, and you can get the powder for a fraction of that,
Right.
So now you have this risk of economic adulteration, is that people are bypassing the official drug approval process, the NDA, ND process, because of cost savings. And this is where the tug of war and the conflict that comes within the profession, because we have to be both, clinical masters and helping and taking care of patients, but we're also fiscal stewards of organizational money. And you have these perverse incentives where, I could use a cheaper drug, but it's in conflict with regulations. And it also increases the risk to the patient because I have to take something from a non-sterile state and make it sterile. And then when you do that on a large scale, that's when you have the risk of having a New England compounding type debacle happen all over again.
Exactly. And it's business everywhere, not just in compounding, but everywhere. It comes down to the economics versus the right thing to do. And so, my hope, as is yours, is that the industry will continue to do what's best for the patient,
right?
Above all else.
Right.
So, we have covered a lot today, and I know we are running short on time, so thank you both for participating. Again, as we get ready to wrap up, I want to give each of you just a moment to share any last thoughts, ideas, considerations for our listeners. Kevin, we'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, just kind of reiterating with that is, again, we have a lot of standards. We have a lot of guidances that are out there, and they are the minimum standards. And as a profession, and I think Eric said it the best, it is our oath, right, to ensure that we're not just focused on the minimum, that we're focusing on best practices. And so really taking a look and saying, hey, we're not just trying to meet this, but we need to strive to do what's best for our patients, because that's what we've oath to coming into this profession, to take care of our patients. And so I urge everyone to look at these practices and not use their own anecdotal practices or what they're seeing at their own institution, and using data, using the science behind what's out there that says that this is a real problem and it's harming patients, and we need to do it in the right manner.
Thanks, Kevin. Eric?
As I like to say, we can do it easy or we can do it hard. And our easy way, believe it or not, contrary to what most people believe, and Kevin, I'm sure, at the beginning when you were putting in your quality systems, it was hard, right? It's like, getting to the summit of the mountain. But once you're there, maintaining it and the things that you're using and lean and Gemba and Kaizen, once you establish a quality system, it almost takes care of itself. And then you just got to just keep control of it. And I think that what the profession has to understand is that if we just look back the last 20 years, the FDA has become more and more involved than we ever thought they would ever get involved. And that's because we have failed to live up to our responsibilities. That's my opinion. And if we continue to fight, kick, and scream and not do the right thing and not embrace these standards and incorporate that in our day-to-day, is that we will continue to be overregulated. That there will be more standards and more regulations heaped on us, that it will just become crushing. And already people think it's crushing. But, I can tell you, if the FDA had it their way, that nothing that pharmacy compounded would be given a BUD greater than 24 hours. I mean, they're tolerant of the USP standards. And that's the other thing that people have to understand, is that if you now read a lot of the FDA guidance, they have embraced 795 and 797, and they have really tried to weave it into this fabric of regulatory oversight, all designed with keeping the patient safe and making sure that when we do compound, we compound accurately and safely. And that's the easy way, because if we get asked to do GMP, you ain't seen nothing yet. So I implore, and I appreciate the leadership that Kevin and others are sharing with the profession. They need to see that success is possible, and it's not as unattainable as everybody believes it to be.
Excellent. Thank you for those closing thoughts. Gives everyone something to think about. I thank both of you, Kevin and Eric, for being here with us today. It's been great to have this conversation, and I know there will definitely be some tidbits that our listeners will be pondering for days and weeks to come.
Cool.
Also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And lastly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you about that. And if you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice. And don't forget to share it with your friends, colleagues, and most importantly, your online networks. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.